Hey everybody, good to see you again. Steve Larson with another 10-minute take here from the Larson homestead. I'm out in my backyard. It's a beautiful day, but a bit blustery, so we've had a cold front come through last night and the wind's blowing, so hopefully that won't get in the way of the audio here. But I'm just out filming here in my backyard, and I wanted to talk to you about a topic that I think is going to be important, in particular for you greenhouse growers and also for you nursery growers, but more specifically probably to the greenhouse trade, and that's insect control during the spring. You know, spring is host to a lot of activities that we encounter in production greenhouses as well as in production nurseries. And so one of the things that we always encounter are the hosts of insects that come along our way during this time of the year. Two particular insect pests I want to address today. That is aphids and thrips. Now, I know that you encounter all different types of insects, or potentially could encounter all different types of insect pests, but in my years of working in the industry, those are the two in the spring that we seem to encounter the most frequently and the most regularly. Aphids, which are fairly easy to control, as well as thrips, which are perhaps the most difficult to control. But one commonality that I'm going to talk about with regards to both of those is that if we get out ahead of the problem and make preventative applications of insecticides, more specifically systemic insecticides, in advance of the problem and prior to the plants getting too mature, we can really have pretty good control of both aphids and thrips with some effective systemic insecticides. I want to go back to a talk that I sent out to you a couple of weeks ago that had to do with pre-emergence herbicides. And one of the things that we talked about with regards to utilizing pre-emergence herbicides is that they're really a preventative control of weeds. We're putting them out in advance of the weed seed germinating and controlling the weeds before they become a problem. I want to carry that theme along into today's discussion because the application of systemic insecticides on a preventative basis can really act as a foundation for good insect control, and in particular aphids and thrips. Now I'll get into some specifics with both aphids and with thrips and how we can control those and which products to use and some rotational options. But I wanted just to highlight this idea that we need to be utilizing preventative drench applications, and so we'll be talking about that as well. Well, one of the things I wanted to do here real quick was just explain why I prefer drenches over sprays. And really, it's a pretty simple idea. When you're drenching a systemic insecticide, you're putting it in the soil and you're putting a much larger volume of active ingredient on the plant as opposed to a foliar spray. When you spray, you're just going to contact the foliage, and then there's a limited amount of active ingredient, especially when the plants are smaller. This is obviously a pretty mature plant. But when you have smaller plants early in the cropping cycle, you don't have a whole lot of surface area to retain that active ingredient. However, when you drench it, the soil can retain that active ingredient. It's available to the plant as the roots grow into the media and can absorb that material and systemically move it up into the plant. So you have the availability of more active ingredient, which can act as a reservoir, if you will, of active ingredient, which adds to the longevity of protection from the systemic insecticide. That is probably the main reason that I prefer drenching, because you can put it on early in the cropping cycle and protect the plant virtually all the way through the cropping cycle. I know that some systemic insecticides last anywhere between 30 days to up to 45 days, even some up to 60 days with a single drench application. And so longevity is a real benefit of drenching versus spraying. In nursery crops as well as greenhouse crops, probably the most common spring pests is aphids. Aphids tend to feed on tender new growth, and they're relatively easy to control and even easier to prevent. A couple of things you need to know about aphids. The females actually give live birth to young that soon begin to also give live birth to their own progeny. As a result, their numbers can grow exponentially fast. Aphids are also known for producing honeydew. Honeydew is a liquid material that's actually the result of the digestion of the plant juices they extract from plants. And this sugary material can drip down on lower leaves and cause them to look like they've been watered or kind of wetted with a sheen-like presence that also will host a fungus known as sooty black mold that can actually cover the leaves. So it can be a real distraction to the quality of the foliage. If you're growing a crop that's known for aphids infestations, what I suggest is you consider drenching early in the cropping cycle, especially with greenhouse crops, and in the early spring for nursery crops with a systemic insecticide. I recommend Altis. Altis at 3.7 ounces per 100 gallons can offer up to 6 to 8 weeks of protection against an aphid attack. Altis is a very effective product on aphids. For an existing infestation, you may want to consider spraying Altis at 10.5 ounces per 100 or Contos at 3.4 ounces per 100. Both products, Altis and Contos, are very effective on aphids, but they tend to work a little slowly. Once treated, the aphids may look alive, but typically they've already stopped feeding, and soon after they've been treated, they'll die within 2 to 4 days. The second most common insect pest in the spring is thrips, and that's principally on flowering greenhouse crops, but also on some flowering nursery crops as well. I won't lie to you, thrips control is very difficult, especially given the fact that their feeding habits are typically deep in protected flower parts, so it's hard to reach them with insecticide sprays. Also, the ability of adult stages to fly in during the course of the crop is also a real challenge. However, I'll say that a preventative drench of a systemic insecticide is one of the best measures for control, and it's a way to keep populations of thrips down to manageable levels. When we drench with Contos at its high 3.4 ounce rate, we can expect to get very good preventative control. You may be required to do some follow-up spray treatments to capture some of those adults that might be flying in, so something like Expire or Hachi Hachi would be good options as rotational applications. So think of these sprays as more of a rescue situation, whereas the application of preventative drenches should really be the lead process for controlling thrips in your crops during the spring. Of course, these aren't the only insect pests you'll encounter this spring, but in my experience, these are typically the most common. Now, the good news is that both Altis and Contos, both excellent systemic insecticide options, also control a wide range of piercing, sucking insect pests like those depicted here: whiteflies, scales, mealybugs, leafhoppers, psyllids, and more. So when you're drenching with these two products, keep in mind that you're getting control of more than just aphids and thrips, but it's really a whole range of insect pests, important insect pests during the spring, that you'll also be preventing. Well, that just about wraps up this episode of 10-Minute Takes. Just wanted to review a couple of things with you before we go. Today we were talking about the preventative systemic control of a few key insect pests in greenhouses and nurseries in the spring. And we want to use Altis as our go-to product for aphids control, Contos as our go-to product for thrips control. One thing I failed to mention in today's episode, and something that would take a little bit longer to discuss, is just about the volume of drench solution that you should be putting into each pot. Be careful with that. Don't over apply too much solution to each pot, so much that it's running out the bottoms of the pots. You're just wasting chemical and money if you're doing that. We'll get into that in a future episode. Well, thank you so much for tuning in today. Appreciate the opportunity to reach out and visit with you. Look forward to doing so in another couple of weeks, and until then, take care. Bye now.